Hello and welcome back to the Architectury Multiplatform Modding in Minecraft video series. And in the last episode, we made our Ruby furnace functional by essentially turning it into a regular Minecraft furnace. So it behaves similar to a furnace. It smelts at the same speed. It processes the same items. And in this episode, we want to add a custom recipe type so that we can specify custom recipes for a Ruby furnace. And the goal is in the end of this episode to replace this RecipeType.smelting here with a custom recipe type, because this is essentially the only line that tells the game what type of recipes this furnace block is able to process. And we need to provide the game with our own recipe definition so that the game knows what to do and what not to do. So let's start by creating a new package in our mod main package here and call it recipe. And in this recipe package, we can now go ahead and create a class for our Ruby cooking recipe. And this class will specify our cooking recipe. And the first thing we want to do here is extend the abstract cooking recipe. Extends abstract cooking recipe. Because again, this is a class provided by the game, and this is a superclass for the regular furnace recipes, for the blasting recipes, etc. That takes a lot of the things we would need to do if we would build a recipe type from scratch away from us, so that we just can focus on the real important stuff. And the real important stuff are, besides the constructor, those four methods we can see down here. Now, the first thing, the constructor, we can just leave it as it is because we just need to pass through all the arguments. The RecipeSerializer, we'll get to back that in a moment. The recipe type, we will also get to that in a moment because we have not registered it yet. The recipe book category, we can just copy over from the regular furnace block what is handled there. And the furnace icon, we can here now give away our tutorial mod items.rubyfurnace.get so that the Ruby furnace is the icon for our recipe type. This is not displayed normally in the game, but for example, mods may display this item. So we want to specify it here. Now we want to register our recipe type, and for this we're going to create another new class, call it tutorial mod recipe types, recipe type, and in here, similar to the many times we did it before, a private static final deferred register for recipe type of question mark. Want to import recipe type, of course, call it recipe types, and initialize this with deferred register.create for our mod ID, tutorial mod ID, and registries.recipe type. And also similar, we want to have a public static registry supplier for our recipe type of Ruby cooking recipe. Let's call this Ruby smelting. And then we want to create a public static void init recipe types. And we want to call this init recipe types from our main init method here, the mod recipe type.init recipe types. And inside this, we now want to initialize our Ruby underscore smelting with recipe types dot register Ruby underscore smelting. This is the name that we later need to specify in our JSON files for our custom recipes. And then we want to create with the lambda notation a new recipe type. And we want to override it to string method. We don't need this java doc comment here. And in here, we just want to return the same string we used above, in this case Ruby_smelting. And then last but not least, we want obviously to call the register method on our default register so that it registers everything to the game. And with that, we have the recipe type. So we can head back to our recipe, go to the recipe type here, and return here our tutorial mod RecipeType.RubySmelting.get. And now we need a recipe serializer. And the recipe serializer essentially is the way to tell the game how to read the JSON files that we will write later. And we want to create a new class for this, tutorial mod RecipeSerializer. And in here, in a similar way, we will first need a default register, type it static final default register for recipe serializer of question mark, recipe serializers, and then default register dot create for tutorial mod dot mod ID and registries dot recipe serializer. And again, public static registry supplier for recipe serializer for our Ruby cooking recipe, Ruby_smelting, and again a public static void init recipe serializers. And then we want a Ruby smelting recipe supplier here, a registry supplier for the recipe serializer, registered with the name Ruby smelting. And here we want not this, but instead we want to create a new abstract cooking recipe.serializer. And in here we can now provide our constructor for the Ruby cooking recipe and specify the default cooking time, for example 70 ticks, which is around a third of a regular furnace, which means that for the default recipe, our Ruby furnace will then be faster, for example, than a blast furnace. And then again, we want to register the default register to the game. And again, we also want to call this init recipe serializers method in our main init method. In our main init method here, tutorial mod recipe serializer dot init recipe serializers. And now that we have this, we can head back to our recipe and return it in the get serializers part up here. So tutorial mod recipe serializer dot Ruby_smelting.get. And with that, we now have successfully set up a recipe type, which we can use here. So instead of RecipeType.smelting in our Ruby furnace block entity, we can go ahead and put tutorial mod RecipeType.RubySmelting.get. And with that, our block entity for our Ruby furnace will try to smelt Ruby smelting recipes. Right now, that means that our Ruby furnace would be pretty useless because there are no Ruby smelting recipes as of now. But we can change that by going to our data and then our mod ID folder and then to the recipe folder. And in here we can create a new JSON file and call it, for example, Ruby smelt _ Ruby from Ruby or.json. And in this file, we can now specify, similar to a regular furnace recipe, a recipe for our Ruby furnace. So the type in this case is our mod ID, and then in this case Ruby smelting, which is the name specified when we registered our recipe type. So here, and here, obviously. And then similarly to a regular recipe, we first specify the ingredient, then we specify the result and the experience the player can get when smelting this recipe. And that is pretty much everything we need to do to add a smelting recipe for our custom recipe smelting type. So let's jump into the game and see if this recipe works. And with that, welcome to the game. And as you can see, I've built a little contraption here with 3 hoppers on the top of the furnaces, each filled with a stack of our ruby ore. And then a regular furnace with a stack of coal, blast furnace with a stack of coal, and a ruby furnace with a stack of coal, so that we can actually see the speed difference between our own recipe type, the blasting recipe type, and the regular smelting recipe type. So if I break this redstone block, as you can see, all 3 furnaces start smelting directly, but as you can see, our ruby furnace is pretty fast, has already done the 3rd item. Our blast furnace is a bit slower, only now has the 3rd, and our regular furnace hasn't even finished the 2nd item yet. So as you can see, our ruby furnace is pretty fast now. What we can also see is if we take our ruby furnace and take, for example, some iron ore, that our ruby furnace will not be able to smelt this iron ore because iron ore is not a recipe for a ruby furnace recipe type. So if you create a custom recipe type and want to include default recipes, you have to add every single one of those yourself. What I would suggest in this case is just copy the regular recipe definition files from the game and replace the recipe type everywhere. And if you want the speed. But there is, as far as I know, at least no simple way to do this other than just creating a file for every single recipe. At least not without using some data generation things that both Fabric and NeoForge support individually, but with Architectury that is currently still in development, so we can't use that. So we either need to go through one of the mod loaders to create all of our files and then copy them over, or we need to copy them over manually in a way. That's the small problem with creating a custom recipe furnace recipe type in this case that we have as of right now. But yeah, as you can see, it works and you can create a pretty fast furnace with it. So with that, you know how to create a simple furnace recipe type, and we now have a ruby furnace that can smelt our items. And in the next episode, we'll go and look a bit into world generation, because as of right now, our ruby ores don't appear anywhere yet, and we want to change that. So world generation is next. See you then. Goodbye.